I'm super excited to introduce them. I can ask them to come on up. That'd be great. And as they're coming up, I'll introduce them. Kristina Ishmael is the Deputy Director, U.S. Department of Education, Office of Education Technology. She's made groundbreaking contributions to the integration of generative AI, education technology, and most recently a co-author of the U.S. Department of Education policy report on artificial intelligence and the future of teaching and learning. Kristina, thank you for your service to our country. Next up, we have someone that very early on I followed on Twitter and now has sort of taken over my Twitter feed, Ethan Mollick. Ethan is the Associate Professor of Management and Academic Director of the Wharton Interactive at UPenn. He's totally at the forefront in all of this. We are deeply honored that he is here. His popular blog, One Useful Thing, is excellent. It's quite honestly, by this point, lots of useful things. And he's given lots of talks all over the place. And also, he's someone that's really pushing the frontiers about asking about the role of creativity in conjunction with tools like this. I really value his work and perspective. And next up, we have Jeffrey Schnapp. He's a professor of Romance languages and literatures and comparative literature. He's the chair of the Department of Comparative Literature and the faculty director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. He's a cultural historian, a designer, a curator, a technologist, someone who's way more interesting than certainly me, and the faculty director and founder of MetaLab at Harvard. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being here today. And last but not least, we've got Bridget Terry Long, the Dean of Faculty for the Professor of Education and Economics in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She has a deep understanding of student needs, educational policies, providing evidence in her work on the effectiveness of things like financial aid policies, post-secondary remedial education, and is just a total citizen of this university and our country. Thank you so much, Bridget.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. And shout out to HGSE up there. Nice that you guys made it across the river. I would not have expected anything less. So as we get started into this panel, I'd like us to take a moment to survey you briefly. I'm wondering, just by show of hands, how many of you are totally comfortable using generative AI in various ways, just by show of hands? Okay. How many of you would say you're more in the early part of your learning journey? Okay, so you have maybe a little bit of experimentation. And how many of you have no idea what this is about, and that's why you're here today, because you're curious? Okay, so that's helpful for us as we start with our questions. So I really want to thank Mitch for getting us started, showing a number of examples. And obviously, we're going to be talking about higher education. Of course, there are so many things that our colleges and universities do. We could think about the implications for research, but today we're really focusing on teaching and learning. So I'm going to start with Kristina. So the department recently offered a number of recommendations on the use of AI in learning and teaching, several which emphasize the role of human decision-making and the importance of trust in learning in technological tools. What will higher education need to grapple with to keep these values central?
Great question. So if you are not familiar with this report that Dustin mentioned and that you have now mentioned, this is focused on K-12, so I always want to preface that. However, we know that many of these recommendations and insights, of course, are applicable in higher education, and then we will be expanding our work within the Office of Ed Tech to include higher ed starting now. So, which is always good. I do not have all of the recommendations memorized, so I want to go through them very quickly. The first one we certainly want to say is emphasizing humans in the loop. I know that, Ethan, you have a lot of thoughts on this, so I can't wait to hear this. Aligning AI models to a shared vision for education, design AI using modern learning principles, prioritize strengthening trust, inform and involve educators. I would also add learners in there. Focus R&D on addressing context and enhancing trust and safety, and then develop education-specific guidelines and guardrails. We can center these values in our policymaking, our implementation, and even the conversations that we're having here. The Biden-Harris administration has taken this moment from the very beginning of this administration to really kind of dig into this work with the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, and then within each of our different agencies, obviously ours being education. And that is really important because we have voluntary commitments from some of the largest companies, some of the ones that have just been shown this morning, that are focused on three things: safety, security, and trust. Those are really critical as consumers, but also as users. And so it is important for us to center that in, again, the policymaking, the implementation, and in all of our conversations that we're having here. So we also have to understand that these technologies are changing so quickly. If you are not familiar with the fact that ChatGPT came out in November of 2022, our report was actually in draft prior to the release of that. And then it was released in May of this year. We had to go in and change things. And that's also an important part of this. We believe in continuous improvement, not only in K-12, but also in higher education. And so this is the moment where we get to talk about these policies with our learners, co-create with them, but then we have to come back to this frequently. And I think that's what higher ed is gonna have to really kind of wrestle with. We cannot simply create the policy and put it on the shelf. We're going to have to continuously look at these different policies, how they're implemented, how these tools are used, and that's what we're going to wrestle with.
Absolutely. So before I even use the word learning journey, there's no endpoint. It's going to keep changing.
Right.
Ethan, if I could pull you in, I've really enjoyed your blogs and tweets, and I'm wondering if you could share a bit about the importance of human interactivity. I know you and your colleague have discussed structured versus interactiveness approaches to student work in AI. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So I really love that demo. That was amazing. I think it showed one approach to working with AI, which is what we're calling, my wife and I do this work together. She has a doctorate in education, and we call that interactionist, right? You're sort of chatting with the AI, and that's very valuable. The AI can answer many questions. We can get people good at prompting. But I think it undervalues in some ways what we can bring as educators to the table and how we can guide our students. And we call this sort of a structured approach. So if you've seen any of our posts, we talk about this a lot. But it's the idea that you can actually provide students with a set of prompts that take them through a process. You're all coders now, by the way. If you're no technical ability, it doesn't matter. You can all code in prose, honestly. And we have an ongoing thesis that teachers are by far the best people at creating these prompts because you can understand different perspectives. Students, you have expertise. So one thing we can do is offer a lot more guidance and center our own expertise by having prompts that guide students in the right direction, and then have that learner-centered view rather than letting the learner kind of interact with the tools completely on their own. Both approaches work, but I think that we should be valuing the idea that we can actually add something to the process as the educators ourselves, right? And so one of the things, just as the example, which I thought was great, is like it wrote a quiz for you. It quizzed you and stuff. Now, we know a lot about how to create, and especially my ed school people in the upper corner, right? We know a lot about how to create good quizzes and tests, how to create low-stakes tests that matter, how to do spaced repetition. We could put that expertise into the system with a prompt that would actually help you create a much better set of quizzes, right? Which doesn't take away from that interactionist approach, but suggests that we can actually add even more of ourselves into the process.
Okay, excellent. Jeffrey, I want to pull you in as well. How do you see generative AI influencing the design of educational tools and experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's an important question, and it's a question I like to think about in terms of the history of AI, because of course, AI has suddenly loomed on the horizon large, but only within recent years. But of course, its beginnings go back to 1956, a conference at Dartmouth College where I taught. That was my first job as an assistant professor. And when Marvin Minsky and company sat around the table back then and were predicting that within 20 years, everything that humans can do will be, AIs will be capable of doing. They got the timing a little bit wrong, but what they were thinking of was not necessarily, probably only in a very limited way, creative practice, all the kinds of things that are of interest to me as a cultural historian, designer, and technologist. And where AI has really exploded, and I think it really had a massive take-up that we're just beginning to see the effects of, are in all kinds of areas that are literally in the arts and humanities, and in fields that might seem at first glance to be distant from that world that these technologies were designed, in a sense, to engage with. So I think when it comes to thinking about this universe of possibilities, whether it's in the classroom or beyond the classroom, and what the tools should look like and how they should be deployed, what is exciting to me are two conjoined areas of practice that I'm trying to implement in my own teaching in a very experimental way, because it's really early days still. And I think some of the examples we just saw and that Ethan just referred to are really great. One of them is this expanded universe of creative practice, from animation to image generation to text generation, and the ways in which it changes the basic practices of self-expression, communication. The flip side of that is what humanists and people in the arts are really good at, which is studying exceptions. The difference between a masterpiece and a trivial work of art is all in details, in divergences. It's the very long tail, and that very long tail is about critical skills. And I think having these kinds of tools where you can produce quickly and efficiently, and often with surprising levels of depth, conventional solutions, and then confronting them creates a fantastic springboard for the development of critical skills. And I think that's where the kinds of tools that I'm interested in particular will take us. It's towards non-trivial uses of these powerful platforms for generating images, texts, forms of storytelling, and that will open up and democratize, actually, all kinds of practices that have been very much limited to small sectors of expert practitioners.
Great. Jeffrey, I want to continue along that line, because a lot of what you've talked about is kind of interdisciplinary work. And it sounds like there are so many opportunities coming together, or perhaps even the creation of new disciplines. What are your thoughts about that?
That's sort of been the bandwagon I've been on for like 30 years. So thank you for the softball. But yeah, I do think that these technologies, and not only these technologies, but a whole set of possibilities that have been part of the world of learning for the past 20, 30 years, are really shifting the ground under which the historical disciplines around which our great universities are built, and really inviting us to reimagine those borderlines. And I think in particular, that those borderlines need to be reimagined across schools, not just divisions within Harvard. It's a battle that is ongoing. Universities are wonderful because they often are very much backward-looking. Standards of excellence, rigor can be backwards-looking, but the future that's opening up under our feet right at this moment is one that where I think a lot of those divisions don't make that much sense anymore. And our students have migrated into these interstitial spaces. Yes. And I think we need not only to accommodate them, but to bring the strengths of those historical disciplines to bear in shaping new kinds of fields, where one of the areas that I'm excited about is where we can rethink the boundary line between theoretical and practical knowledge, between the applied especially, and those more conventional kinds of classroom-based models. And I think that's not something that we're well equipped to do. A perfect example is the importance of making as a form of scholarly practice, classroom practice. It's contained within very small containers within the contemporary university, but I see making as a practice that extends across a really wide spread of domains, including the social sciences, the historical disciplines in the humanities, and that really changes the conditions under which we teach, the kind of infrastructures that we require, as well as the pedagogical approaches that we adopt. And I think those approaches can be increasingly inclusive in ways that look at forms of learning that have not always been represented in some of those disciplinary domains and well supported.
Absolutely. So I just want to take a moment to thank HILT and the entire HILT team for, I think you're exactly right. This is an issue that brings all of us together all across Harvard, and so it's wonderful hosting this conference today. Kristina, I want to come back to you. So we started to talk a bit about all of the wonderful possibilities that are out there, but what kind of institutional supports and resources are going to be necessary to help integrate these kinds of generative AI into our teaching practices and other practices?
Yeah. So Bill Gates keynoted ASU GSB back in April and said that we know that the inequities are going to be very visible for the next year or so, where we will see schools that have access or learners that have access, they will flourish, and then those that don't have access are just going to kind of stagnate. That is really hard to think about. But it is an important thing for us to think about as we are leading always with equity in mind and making sure that everyone has access to the tools that they need. So it's going to take the interdisciplinary teams. I come from the K-12 world. I am a former early childhood teacher. I'm also an EL teacher. I taught multilingual learners. And the work that I was able to do, not only in my classroom, but then with the team across the entire district, was really important. And that is just my normal. But that is not the norm in higher education. And so institutional support is going to require that we do look out across the entire system. We need instructional designers. We need technologists. We need our lawyers. We need them to all be working together collectively to provide ongoing training, to provide technical assistance. And having these difficult but fun conversations, challenging conversations, because we cannot bury our heads in the sand. And you will notice the difference between institutions that are doing blanket bans versus those that are leaning in. I was reading a piece from the LA Times yesterday on my flight up here about Caltech. Caltech has reduced the admissions requirements for their programs. Especially to provide more equitable access. They are requiring students that didn't have higher levels of math, of science, to take some online courses to make sure that they're going to pass and be ready to join their programs. In the same article, they then share their AI policy, which is students cannot use it. So what's wrong with that? So that's already going against the equity conversation that we're having here. And so it is going to require all folks working on this together.
Right, absolutely. I want to continue on this issue about inequality. So obviously, and as Mitch pointed out, this is not the first time we've had this new technology. Unfortunately, in education in the past, what we've seen is this exacerbated inequality rather than actually supporting and bringing up some of our learners that need the most supports. I think AI has huge possibilities, with personalized kind of a learning and so forth, but what's going to be necessary to make sure, so just kind of elaborating on your answer, Kristina, opening up to Ethan and Jeffrey, to make sure we're addressing this in a way that's not exacerbating inequality, but instead perhaps addressing it.
So I'll push with a sort of maybe controversial view, which is I think this is the greatest leveler we've ever seen, and I think we're not treating it even with enough urgency when we're saying we need committees and groups like, right? Okay, I'm saying.
No, I
right.
love this.
So I think, so first of all, everybody in 169 countries has access for free to GPT-4 through Bing's creative mode, right? That's the purple mode if you haven't seen that. And as far as I can tell from talking to Microsoft, they have a commitment to doing that in the near future, right? That is the best model you can get. You can go to Goldman Sachs or any other, like all they have is GPT-4, and actually it's not as enabled as the version of that. So from an equity standpoint, we have this amazing tool that can work as a universal tutor, that can help you solve problems, that can help you write in perfect English, can help you code, can help you research. I think we need to be diving into this as a absolutely important thing to do, right? Most people in the world don't have access to the education we have here. Yep. I can send somebody 2 prompts that will get them, they're flawed, they won't get everywhere there, but I can send someone 2 prompts that will take them through ideation for entrepreneurship, or how to think through a problem from a new perspective. I feel like that is the burning thing. I think we're way too focused on our own classrooms and trying to figure out what to do with the 30 students in our classroom when we have an audience that we can actually democratize to right now. And to me, that is the compelling need as educators, is like, if we're gonna sit back, we're gonna miss this thing, and a whole bunch of for-profits are jumping in to figure out how to sell things. You guys are experts in education, especially in your subfield. You should be putting out prompts that actually advance the state of the art, giving warnings about where they fail. Like, this is far beyond the classroom, and the equity issue is actually better than I've seen from any other technology I've seen. You don't need money to do this. You could, with internet access from a phone, you could do this.
If you couldn't tell, I went a little bit off script Everybody got very excited. Jeffrey, do you want to jump into this?
Yeah, I share Ethan's view, I think, as I already hinted at before. I do nonetheless have a concern about the future development of a lot of these technology platforms, because if you look, and here we are in HBS, it seems like an appropriate question. The financial models to support and sustain many of these efforts are not crystal clear. Many of them are at this point lost leaders. So I would want to see us being proactive in making sure that that potential is one that's realized and sustained by engagement by the major players who are setting educational policies, setting educational priorities, making sure that this powerful potentiality is realized and remains accessible to the widest possible user populations.
Okay. Ethan, I wonder, you've done some research on the real world impacts of AI. Could you give us some examples of what you've learned?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a stream of research coming out that shows that this is exactly as big a deal as we're all worried it's a big a deal, right? So like, leaving aside the idea that it's that future models will do different things, and they will, right? I suspect Gemini will be out within the next month, and that's going to be better than GPT-4, which, by the way, 2 years old, right? Like, there's no reason to suspect this pace of change is changing. The AI you're using today is the worst AI you will ever use. So you have to kind of absorb that. That is a real fact.
That is wild.
It's wild and hard to grapple with, right? But so just a couple of quick studies, right? So one is by my colleagues at Wharton, Christian Turwich and Carl Ulrich, along with other co-authors, where Carl wrote the book on product development, and they have a very well-regarded product development class. They put the MBA students in the class, say what you will about MBAs, but we're here at Wharton, at Harvard, at HBS. But they're pretty innovative, and put them up against GPT-4, and GPT-4 absolutely smoked them, right? So of the top 40 ideas by willingness to pay, quality, everything else, I think 34 of them came from the AI, the rest came from humans. We're seeing this effect everywhere, like on any measure of creativity, blown away, right? I just completed a study with a lot of colleagues here, too long a list to name, and at MIT and elsewhere, but we just did a research project at BCG, the sort of elite consulting company, just putting in GPT-4, no special wrappers, no other material. The quality of jobs done by consultants went up by 40%. As a result of the study, the speed of doing things increased by 12%. The amount of tasks they completed went up by 25%. Wow. To put that in context, steam power, when steam power was put into a factory in the early 1800s, it increased performance by 18 to 22%. Like, this is the beginning, and we're already seeing huge effects. So the other thing I would say is part of what our job is to think about what our students' life is outside of school. That's about to change much more more quickly than what's happening in the classroom, right? We've got some time, we've got some breathing room. Harvard's not going anywhere, but jobs and stuff are going to be changing very rapidly in a very real way, and that is today. That is not 5 years from now, future hype, blockchain's going to matter. This is like right now, right? So we have to grapple with that.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, these new tools can change our teaching, but do you feel like the finish line is now changing because how we need to prepare our students, or not how, but what we need to be able to prepare them to do in the job market is also changing. You know, what would be your advice to instructors now about how to rethink what they're preparing their students to do? Kristina, you want to start?
So we work very closely with the Department of Labor, and their recent data is showing that 38% of the top skills required for jobs have changed in the past 5 years. So, but that's not even, I mean, that is of course inclusive of GPT coming out, but we know that they're going to continue to change. And so the skills are critical right now. We're seeing employers start to move to skills-based hiring rather than certification. And so that's also an important thing for us to know. But educators, more than anything, have the ability right now to help learners understand that it's okay to learn something right now and then unlearn it. And then upskill, because we're going to need to do that. These skills are going to be archaic with the best AI that we're using right now, which is still so weird. We will constantly have to be upskilling. And that's another important thing as we think about workforce development. And for those that are not necessarily in the workforce right now either, or who need to upskill, or who will have jobs that are potentially transformed by AI, this is something that all of you all play a role in, is helping students and learners understand, learn it now, be able to unlearn it and then upskill from there. That's really important.
Absolutely. Jeffrey, do you want to add to that?
No, just to agree completely that, and I think just because we're excited and exploring the power of many of these tools, we have a tendency to attribute agency to them. But when it comes to the workplace of the future, to the kind of needs that we have to address in our approaches to education and training, there are transportable and translatable skills that will move across as that tool set changes, evolves, develops capabilities that are far more foundational. And getting that balance right between getting people deeply acquainted with the tools and technologies, having deep roots in different kinds of forms of thinking, disciplinary traditions, that they can tap into as they make those leaps, as they adapt, as they change. I think it's getting that balance right that's crucial. And I don't think it necessarily involves giving up on a lot of the kind of core values that educational institutions have been committed to for centuries, but it involves making them nimble, giving them a kind of agility that allows them to move with that shifting landscape. And that landscape has always been shifting, but I think we're sensing a kind of speed up in that shifting landscape that requires, I think, doubling down on some of these educational goals and values.
Okay. Well, obviously, we're going through many, many examples of what's possible with generative AI. But just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. So how do we prepare our students and our colleagues to be ethical users? Ethan, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, it's a tough problem because people talk about ethics and they mean a lot of different things, right? So we could talk about the ethics of how, are we okay with the fact that these systems were trained on possibly copyright data? Are we okay with the fact they're trained on biased data that's mostly, mostly things that were easily scrapable? I mean, by the way, if you ever look inside the databases that train the original pile, so are the basis of the GPT-4, although I think the new models are using cleaner data sources. Not only are they like Wikipedia and stuff, but they're these pirated giant archives of books called Books 1, Books 2, and Books 3. And if you open them up, it's almost all self-published romance novels and Harry Potter fan fiction. Also, all the Enron emails are in there, by the way. So like these things are trained on all sorts of stuff. But OK, so aside from that, how it's trained, right? You probably have heard that a lot of the reinforcement learning through human feedback is done by low-paid workers in Kenya who have to see kind of terrible content. We have the idea of companies that are doing this, and we don't understand how they're putting what they're putting on the model. They're owning the models, as you said. Then there's the additional layer of like, what does this all become? Like, this AI safety issue for the future. So there's lots of layers of ethics, and I think that we have to, like, I'm a little bit of a pragmatist here, which is that this is obviously being used places, so we have to decide as educators what part of this do we want to highlight in what way. We can't just say there's ethical concerns. It's how do we grapple with this? Some of these are systemic concerns. Some of these are concerns about how we use this and the kind of results we get out, right? You put an image into one of the image generating AIs, entrepreneur, you'll get a white dude most of the time. And the way that that DALL-E gets around this, by the way, is secretly inserts the word female or minority in the text in ways you can't see to make sure there's diversity, right? Like much less of a problem for the large language models, which are kind of still have biases, but they're harder to get at because they're kind of pounded out of these systems. So ethics is complicated. And then on top of that, there's the idea, and I hope you all know this, but I will repeat this again for everybody because I can't say this enough. You cannot detect AI writing. Any attempt you do to detect AI writing is going to cause more ethical problems than not detecting it because detectors don't work. When everyone who tells you they are is lying to you, all the companies making them. When they do, and they have high false positive rates to people who speak English as a second language. Yes. And if you're using your gut feel to determine things, guess what? Your gut heuristics are broken. So that's cat's out of the bag. Take-home essay is broken forever, and we just have to kind of deal with that fact and figure out how to reconstruct what's going forward. But there's a lot of ethical problems. So we can't just say it's one thing, just like there's not one use for AI, right? Your students are using it to explain things to themselves, right? They're asking it hopefully for reflections in kind of amazing ways Mitch saw, but they're also using it to get feedback in an outline. They're using it to get ideas for a paper. They're using it for a sentence they're having trouble with. They're using it for a grade they didn't understand. How are you, when you say you ban or permit AI, that is also fractal. So complexity is part of this here, but we also have to move at the same time. If you're creating policies in your class that ban AI use, I spoke to someone in a major bank which banned AI use, and she wrote the policy, and she told me she wrote it with ChatGPT and emailed it to herself because it was too annoying to write by hand. So there's a lot to grapple with here.
There is definitely a lot to grapple with. Let's kind of separate out, I think, two kind of categories. You, with your last example, brought up one, I think, that many faculties immediately worried about, and that is academic integrity and that piece of it. But you also emphasize another part that's really important. I know one of my faculty used an example of how ChatGPT just is perpetuating bias, prejudice, stereotype, and students may not be aware of that. So I want to continue kind of grappling with this issue, both the academic integrity, but also perpetuating bias. Kristina, your thoughts?
Yeah, so this is something that we've certainly engaged some external organizations on, in addition to our colleagues over at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Algorithmic Justice League, folks in Code Justice, which is a student-led group that are really focused on this, and they are trying to kind of look under the hood as far as where data sets are coming from, understanding where the biases may present themselves in algorithms. But we also have to look at the pipeline issue in all of this. For anyone that's going into this field, are they inclusive and representative of our actual population? That is also how we can think about potentially changing the data sets that are trained and be more inclusive and representative of our population in general. So it is one of those questions that we will continue to wrestle with. Don't think we have an answer by any means, but I really appreciate how you're thinking about there are multiple layers of ethics, because when we talk about this with White House colleagues, they're like, ethics, yeah. And responsible use, how do we talk about that? I find it interesting to hear about the bank application as well, because I also sit on the working group for internal policies at the Department of Education. And it's led by our our CIO's office. And they are like, okay, well, we're gonna do like an interim policy where people can use it as long as we don't use personally identifiable information, things like that. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I can understand that. But then they're like, but maybe we don't want everyone to use it. And I was like, what? Because we're doing the policy externally, and I said we have to match here as well. You cannot say ban it internally, and then we're telling schools and institutions to go use it. That's a problem. And so we also have to look at it, within our own internal uses too, and that is a hard thing to do. It is putting the mirror up to ourselves. So I know that institutions are also kind of dealing with that right now as well.
Absolutely. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I mean, my two fellow panelists have already shared a lot of wisdom on this subject. I don't really have that much to add. The community that I'm part of, a little bit like the example you were just showing, is like ethics moves right to the center of the conversation before you even start talking about the fact that these same ethical questions apply to the society that we live in, the whole context within which these tools and technologies are being used. So I have almost the opposite problem, which is to get people beyond the ethics to getting their hands dirty. Getting engaged in forms of practice, understanding how those forms of practice can expand or alter or improve or raise issues or problems that are critical problems that they need to think about. I think the ethics conversation always needs to be in tandem with a deepening sense of engagement and knowledge with what the tools can do, can't do, the possibilities that they open up, and the ways they can improve some of the objectives and values that we have as a community of teachers and researchers committed to a certain vision of society and to our educational institutions nourishing that vision and set of values.
Right.
Can I mention, sorry,
Sure.
I failed to mention this. Wednesday morning, I had the opportunity to train our entire senior leadership on this. And I say this, like, I had an hour, come on. So I talked them through our AI report, I talked through the recommendations, modeled a couple of different tools that they could use, and then I actually had them get up and move around. So we did a graffiti wall where we had prompts, and they had to kind of think about the applications for us at Department of Education. So I had the Office of General Counsel's Assistant Secretary. I had the Assistant Secretary from Office for Civil Rights. Like, these are also, AI continues to come up in a lot of these conversations, and they're like, oh, that doesn't apply to us. And I was like, oh, are you sure? Because if you know what the Office for Civil Rights does, we're dealing with discrimination across any sort of learning. And so the Assistant Secretary for OCR was like, oh, I see it now. And it's not that we're going to wait and be reactionary when there's actually a complaint that's filed, that we need to be more proactive in this sense as well, because we also want to protect students and we want to protect our learners here. So it's really important, again, that it's multidisciplinary and that everyone is a part of that conversation, but that they can see how it applies to their respective areas as well.
Okay, absolutely. Just want to let you know in a moment, we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. There were several questions that were submitted ahead of time, so just start thinking a bit about your questions. But I want to ask the panel, starting with Jeffrey. We've been talking about the fact we need to take advantage of these opportunities. It's already here. But how, going from the other side and given my field, how are we going to know if it's actually improving things? How are we going to know which practices are really the ones that we need to continue with all this experimentation? What kind of data, what kind of analytic systems do we need to set up so that we don't, a few years from now, we're just still experimenting but have no idea of whether or not it's actually having an impact or a positive impact?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've seen so many waves of experimentation with classroom practice where, there's a hype cycle that lasts for a certain period of time. You've got to have tablets in every class, and then you look at the outcomes and they're really not transformative, or they're marginal. So I think it's a fundamental question with this. The approach that in my lab, the Meta Lab, we've adopted, our feeling was that one of the pieces that's really missing here, because we are in a very early phase of experimentation with the classroom applications in particular of these tools and technologies, is a place to share experiences and models of excellence. So we launched this year an AI pedagogy project, which is literally just a platform for teachers to post and share examples of their practice at all levels of education. And I think that kind of a forum it's only a starting point, but I think it's an important starting point because we've seen over and over again that when you create these kinds of platforms, we pursued an earlier one. We were involved in incubating the Million Syllabus Project, which is a kind of syllabus explorer environment, that there's just so much to be gained by looking at models of practice and learning from other people's experience. And it's in that sifting process that is set off by creating these kinds of sharing platforms that you begin to move towards an answer that, of course, there are other tools as well, metrics that we need to adopt. But I think sharing information is where that process needs to start, in my view.
Okay, great. Starting to go to some of the pre-submitted questions, and Ethan, I think this one's perfect for you. What are you doing in your day-to-day work that has taught you the most about generative AI?
So I have a standard, two standards actually. Okay, so the two standards to know that you've hit enough generative AI is you've probably used the most recent models for about 10 hours. Like you can't use GPT 3.5, you're going to be like, oh, it's not that great. Use the latest model, right? Or wait a month. And then the second is you have to have 3 sleepless nights. And I'm not joking about that. If you have not had a moment of crisis, and this is no, like, there are moments of, fake, but feelings of sentience in the machine. It's not real, but it is very convincing that it is. If it doesn't do something you didn't think it would do, if you haven't stayed up all night being like, oh God, what does it mean to think? What's it mean to be a human? What does it mean? What do my kids do for a living? What do I do? What do my students do? If you haven't had that, you have not used it enough, because I don't know anyone who, you can start being useful after reconstructing yourself after the crisis, but you need to get through that crisis point. So I think use is the most important thing, right? So one thing I like to emphasize to people, there's no instruction manual, right? Like I talk to OpenAI like once a week. I talk to Microsoft once a week. I talk to Google. Nobody knows anything. Nobody knows the full capabilities of these systems. No one knows how they're used. That is incredibly scary, but also incredibly exciting, because guess what? Everyone in this room is an expert in some area of like better than anyone else in the world. This is the bat signal for academics right now, right? Like this is the time where we actually can make it, like you put one of your theory papers into Claude and say, how do I apply this to this real world situation? It'll give you a good answer. Like all of that theory, all that thinking, all that framework, all that expertise can be used to guide AI in some narrow area or another. So I would be desperately urging you to use it in your area of expertise. Understand what we're calling the jagged frontier. AI is like really good at some things and bad at other things. And if you don't use enough, you won't know why, right? So for example, it can write a darn good sonnet and almost a full sestina, like messes up the envoy, but it doesn't do a 50-word paragraph, because the AI sees tokens, not words, and it can't count words properly. So if you don't use AI enough, you're gonna be like, this is idiotic. It can't write 50 words. Anyone can write 50 words, but it can write a poem. How does it do that? So you have to learn enough to understand the dimensions of that jagged frontier, be ready for the fact that these models are the worst you're ever gonna use, and just start using them. And use them with the spirit of exploration and not the idea that like, I'm gonna find a flaw and then I'm gonna stop, because I guarantee almost anything you find that it doesn't do, with enough prompting, it will probably do it, right? It takes us a huge amount of effort to find things that we know that AI can't do well at all. So experiment, use that, like in your area of expertise, find the shape of that jagged frontier. That's how I would start.
Does it count if it was sleepless nights because of putting out a policy report?
Probably. I hope you're not sleeping is probably helpful.
Or in my case, if you get started and you have a set of questions, and they're like, oh, I should ask that. Oh, I should ask that. And then it's 3 hours later, and you're asking it, how can I get my 15-year-old to study? Although, Mitch, I did notice you said please and thank you quite often.
Yeah,
it was
that was very polite.
It was
very polite back to you. So on the other side, there was a pre-submitted question. Will those teachers who don't use AI in the classroom be left behind? Is this a universal inflection point in our teaching? Kristina?
Directly from the Secretary of Education has said this. Those who use AI, and this is across all sectors, honestly, but within education, of course, those who use AI will replace those who do not. Bold statement, I know.
Okay, yes.
Yes, yes, period.
Rare in academia to get the answer. It's not, it depends. Yes.
Jeffrey, would you like to elaborate? Do you agree?
I basically, yes. But why wouldn't you have fun? The threshold has been lowered to the point where it's no longer, the obstacles that once stood in your way to experiment and play as a teacher have been removed. So I think it would be a shame if somebody's conception of teaching would exclude those kinds of forms of engagement.
Okay. Going to the audience, who has a question? We'll start here, though. Please.
Start it. First of all, thank you. I want to pick up when we talked about AI and equity. And Ethan, I really share your optimism because I'm optimistic, but I want us to really think deeply about this. Yeah. You've mentioned this wide availability of AI and free access to it, maybe as one way to move toward equity. And that made me actually think about MOOCs, if we still remember it, right? This idea of enthusiasm we've had precisely because they were widely and freely accessible. And we know it's not exactly panning out the way we would hope. And recognizing the important differences between, obviously, generative AI and MOOCs, I'd like us to think of, in your opinions, what are some of the critical steps that we really need to take? And we can think about we in any way you want, but what are those critical steps for us to move toward equity?
Right. And so great question. So this is referring to some of Harvard X's early work with MOOCs, and then the analysis showing that it was actually more educated people who were taking advantage of the MOOCs, even though the hope was, it was available to everyone.
I love that we have this reminder. Just, okay, sorry.
Oh, yes. I do want to give credit to my team at HGSE. This is what we use when we have big forums.
Brilliant.
I thought it was a bot.
It was not a response to you, don't worry.
No, it was not. It was not.
I feel like this is passive aggressive, but it's a giant screen telling you.
30 seconds, ends in a question mark. But you asked a great question.
You did. You did. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, I think this has come up a couple times, right? So GPT is a GPT, ironically, right? For historians of technology, general purpose technology, these are the things that affect everything we do in uneven and different ways, right? So the result is that a lot of the other tools took a very strong approach to how teaching had to work, right? So there's a didacticism to MOOCs that is like receive and listen that we know has never been the best way to learn, but that's what we could do at scale. One laptop per child, right, was a constructivist approach where if we just give people laptops, they'll figure out how to learn. What's really exciting about taking the AI perspective perspective on this, and we can address your equity question also, is that it lets us take kind of equity approach, right? It doesn't tie us into something. You saw this really great set of examples from Mitch about how do we use as a teacher to interact with? How does it we use as a prompter to get us to think? The AI can meet you at different levels. You say explain things at in analogies that I understand and give a context about yourself. It'll use analogies you understand. So I think part of what we need to think about is like taking the best what we know about how education works and trying those techniques, to go back to what you said earlier, and just doing some experiments. We can finally find out like what methods are actually working and which aren't, because the AI is adaptable in that kind of way. So I think part of the exciting thing to me is like, if you haven't, by the way, just another tool to try, if you haven't used ChatGPT on your phone and used their voice recognition system, it's called Whisper. It is literally superhuman hearing in that it can hear things humans can't. But you could speak to it with an accent in a variety of different languages, and it will pull it all together and answer it in English or whatever language you want. Like there starts to be all of these tools that allow us to access information in new ways, and as instructors, we can start to think about what techniques do we want to try out? Like what approaches do we want to use? What if we try a didactic approach versus a reflective approach versus a flipped classroom approach? The cost of that just dropped dramatically from having to build a giant platform. So to me, that's the exciting part.
I also think of our special populations when it comes to equity. So using the Whisper mode allows our students with disabilities, our multilingual learners, to also have access to the same tools that our gen populations do. And that's another important piece in the equity conversation there for sure.
I just add just one point. You brought up MOOCs as an example. I think the MOOC model, there were a lot of problems with the way that those models were rolled out. I mean, I like to use as a comparison set, Khan Academy, which is extraordinarily successful, very much bottom up. And the MOOC model had some problems, I think, in the way that it was deployed. And I think it is pertinent to our larger discussion about creating sustainable generative AI platforms that will serve the collective interest.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief because I'm scared of what they'll say about me.
The sign that we use
You have to watch out. The next layer is.
So very simply, you mentioned like take-home essays are dead now. I wonder if you have any thoughts on what this means for graduate education with the role of the dissertation.
Ethan, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So the answer is no idea, right? I mean, honestly, like a lot of things have broken in a very short period of time, and we have to reconstruct them. A lot of good is lost, and a lot of good things are opportunities. So one thing I just want to put in perspective on cheating, and just writing in general, is that I wrote about the homework apocalypse, like AI could solve all our homework. I thought this would be a huge spur to action for every teacher out there. It turns out everyone just decided to kind of ignore the fact that all their homework broke, right? And are just saying like, don't use AI, right? Maybe we can detect it. And I think that what I'm seeing there, right, is this idea, like, by the way, everyone was cheating already, right? There's 20,000 people in Kenya, at least before ChatGPT, whose full-time job was writing essays. So like cheating was already a common thing, and we just didn't have to face it, right? So I think this is going to make us face a lot of broken stuff with the system. One of the things I think a lot about with writing, and my wife's been doing some work on this, is like we don't actually have a lot of evidence about what parts of essays, aside from learning to write, what parts of essays make you think, what is busy work, what is real work, because we're all writers at heart, or we wouldn't be academics. A lot of us are at least on the writing side. We're used to that's how we think, that's how we operate. We're going to have to rethink that from the ground up and decide, okay, what's valuable about this? Is it about being a master in a field, and orchestrating the AI? Is it about being able to stand orally and give a unique presentation on this? Is it about being able to orchestrate a team of AIs to do much more work than you could do before? Like another thing we're not talking about enough is like this greatly expands what you can do. My students now are required to do at least one impossible thing in my class. That's literally in the syllabus. Like if they can't code, I want fully working apps. If they've never done graphic design before, I really want a beautifully graphically designed packet. Every assignment they turn has to be critiqued by at least two famous entrepreneurs through history that give them specific feedback on what they did wrong, right? So I think we have to reimagine. I think we have to rethink. I think we have to go back to learning objectives and learning principles and rebuild from there, and that's not easy. So please help us with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I could just add also a historical perspective, the balance between the privileging of writing, of written communication skills, and oral performance skills has been a balancing act that universities have been carrying on for 4 centuries. And this rebalances that. I think the role of oral, live, public speaking type assignments is going to increase as a function of the way in which writing is being changed by these technologies. And I welcome that. I don't see that as a crisis. And it's only a crisis with respect to a model that we inherited from the last half century of academic practice.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. Just to add, I think, when we are seeing job candidates come through, it's the presentation that's really important, but actually the most important part is the Q&A, the interaction, exchange of ideas. How do you think about this? And that's going to continue to be important. But yes, we have to rethink so many things. Okay, question there.
It might be longer than 30 seconds, but we'll end with a question mark. So Kristina, thank you so much. You said that teachers in K-12 settings, who use AI will probably replace those who do not. What do you think is the role of AI in early childhood classrooms? How do you see that?
That's a really good question. So I like to think of it as more on the teacher support right now as far as early childhood applications. There is obviously a lot of research that still needs to be done. There is some that has been done as far as any sort of introduction of technology with younger learners. But we're really thinking that the teacher support is where we're going to see the most benefit for any sort of AI. So anything from rote tasks of taking attendance, or whatever that may look like whenever the learners may come into their classroom. I think we're kind of in that space. We don't know yet. But we also need, again, the folks that are willing to try it out to help us understand what it could potentially do with our youngest learners. I'm really excited to see about it, to see the potential with our multilingual learners as well. So that'll be really fun, of course.
Okay, I see a question up there.
So I wanted to ask about this intermediate part when we now know that it's still hallucinatory, the tools are still hallucinatory. How do you suggest that we approach this intermediate part before we make them better in terms of our students? And my other question is about the augmentation of bias in these tools. So how do you approach that in the classroom as well?
Jeffrey, do you want to start us off this time?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak for my own practice as a teacher at the undergraduate and graduate level. But one of the aspects of both the generative AI visual tool platforms and text platforms that I like to use to develop critical skills is their ability to quickly regenerate. In other words, to show how you can create multiple versions of things, and then you have to make distinctions. You have to make critical judgments. What's a good prompt? What's a bad prompt? How close do you get to your intentionality? So I think, for me, the problem of hallucinations is not really a problem. It's an opportunity to do a deep dive on the capabilities of a given tool, and to begin to develop a critical discourse around it and a sense of critical sensibilities in the part of students. So that's how I tackle it in my classroom today. But again, for me, this is still early days. I think for most of it, it's early days in terms of how it transforms itself into a kind of stable pedagogy.
And so, I mean, I think that part of this is a moving target, right? So we don't have a lot of really great hallucination comparisons. There's a paper where they gave various AIs the neurosurgery board exam. GPT-4 passed it, of course. But the hallucination rate for GPT 3.5, the free chat version, was 44%. For Bard was 44%. For chat was 22%, and for GPT-4 was 2%. So I think part of the issue, we used to have an assignment, the very first paper we put out on using AI was taking advantage of hallucinations and having the students be accountable for their work and teaching the AI and fixing issues. The problem is GPT-4 is so good that the hallucinations have become incredibly subtle, right? Less obvious in most cases than especially when you use Bing, which has internet search. So I think it's a thing to grapple with. I mean, but it is a moving target. So hallucinations are a problem. I think our question is, what are we comparing it to, humans or not? The bias issue, similarly, it was much more obvious before, more obvious for images, less obvious in the writing. And so I think it's a tough problem. And this is where the exploration kind of matters in the context of your class, right? So in a class where you can open up that box a little bit and try and do some exercises that force it into these issues, and I'm happy to send, if you want to send me an email, I'll send you some links to a couple papers on bias that have some interesting ideas for exercises potentially. But it's getting harder to find these things because it's the incentive of the companies to make that obvious bias disappear. They're red teaming that really hard. So it's a tough situation, especially with the kind of moving target of it. Hallucination is a real problem. I think we just have to decide are we okay? Like, it hallucinates less than my students in most cases when I grade papers, right? Like we know that's how it gets higher grades, right? So, but it still messes stuff up. So how do we as a teacher intervene? Where do we trust it? Where do we not trust it? At what level do we start trusting it more? It's a tough situation. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just educating students that it's not Google, and even Google will give you the wrong answer. For those of you who are still experimenting, ask one of these AIs to write your own biography. And see how much of it gets right. Borrowing this from Chris Stubbs, the Divisional Dean of Sciences, it's very illuminating on what it gets right, but also what it doesn't. So question here in the center.
How do you see generative AI as being transformative of the constructed environment for teaching and learning and classroom practice? How does that influence what we do when we're face-to-face with our students?
My gut feeling on this is we're going to be moving to flipped classroom active learning. Like that's always been the goal for a long time, right? Like that's like we have enough research saying, hey, this works pretty well. The problem is the content outside of class that you were supposed to be learning on in flipped classroom settings were either terrible MOOC videos or textbooks, right? And so too many of us still do non-active lectures and things like that. I think so. Part of the easy thing is if you haven't asked the AI to help you prep for classes, it's a really interesting experience. Come with exercises, come with interesting discussion topics, come up with, it can help you prepare for an active classroom discussion. So the outside of class is where the preparation happens. Inside of class is where active learning, assessment, and other kinds of interactions happen, which changes the classroom environment too, right? Like lecture hall, stage on a stage stuff, we've always known was kind of uncomfortable. We've all grown up that way. Many of us don't have other, that's our mode. So there's going to be a transition. But I do think that there is a clear vision of what a successful future looks like that researchers here and elsewhere have illuminated for us. We have to kind of decide how to get there. I think that seems like the most obvious short-term solution. And then the longer question is, the real question all of us need to be asking all the time is like, how good do these models get? And nobody knows the answer to it, because that implies a very big change in the next few years.
Okay, to keep us on time, I think we have time for one more question.
Hello. Thank you for the very great discussion. I'm asking this question as a parent who is the first teacher of a child, especially around early childhood learning, how parents are already struggling with this, striking a balance between technology, screen time, and traditional ways of teaching. Like, has there been any research done, or do you have any information on how parents can best strike this balance between learning, asking Alexa questions, and the fact that the children are learning critical thinking? Thank you.
It's a great question. So our office has previously put out a report on integrating technology with early childhood. It is a couple of years old, so just want to preface that. Definitely pre-pandemic. However, the work that we are doing in conjunction with the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Domestic Policy Council at the White House focuses on digital health, safety, and citizenship, expanding just the digital citizenship to include what does health and safety look like when we're using these technologies. So we will have the flagship publication that comes out of our office, the National Ed Tech Plan. It is K-12 focused. There will be a higher ed supplement that will come out hopefully by next summer. But the new version of the National Ed Tech Plan will be coming out in January of 2024 and will include more information on that. And it really does include conversations about this, striking that balance. We know the data shows that parents who are continually using their phones in front of their children are disengaged. So how do we strike that balance? And then we have curated a wonderful collection of resources from other agencies, including the CDC, including HHS, like all of these different agencies that have put out resources to address this very topic. And so those will be coming out. The curated list on the OET website will be coming out later this fall.
Please join me in thanking our panel.